The sea was a black mirror with a pulse, and the man at the prow had learned to listen to its heartbeat the way other men listened to sermons. Euron Greyjoy stood where the silence cut the world, boots planted on wet planks, cloak heavy with spray, his hair loose and salt-stiff against his cheeks. The water heaved in long, muscular swells that came in from the narrowness like breath forced between a fighter's teeth. Above, the sky was a hush of cloud without moon. Ahead, Dragonstone rose from the dark, an impossible animal of stone, its spine bristling, its head turned toward King's Landing as if sniffing for smoke. The fortress's silhouette was a fable carved against the stars, all ribs and claws and serpentine ramparts. The windows were dead, no candles, just a pale bruise of phosphor where the surf struck the basalt and glowed. He did not speak. Men moved around him like thoughts he had already had. Lines went out. Sound traveled low. A few words, the scrape of spar against spar, the sigh of oars dipped with reverence. The other ships of his van, the Reaver's Grin, Widow's Tally, Icetooth, lesser names for lesser hulls, fanned to leeward, hugging the shoals beneath the dragon's tail. Farther off he could feel the bulk of his fleet by the way the water shouldered differently. Presence had weight even when it could not be seen. A taste of bitterness lingered at the back of his tongue. Resin and shadow and something like copper. Shade of the evening did that. It made the sea talk in other voices too, voices with more vowels, longer than men could say. Euron smiled into the dark. Dragonstone had slept too long. Stannis had bled its garrison for his folly, and then bled on the snow himself to spite the gods. The king's castle had been left to salt spray and heritage, a shell full of dragon bones no one bothered to count. The seven hells were full of lords who thought stones defended themselves. He lifted a hand. The signal, barely a silhouette against the sky, went to the next prow, then to the next. Oars that were already quiet found a quieter rhythm. The silence nosed through the fringe of eddies that feathered off the fong-shaped shoal known to pilots as the Widow's Hush. Lanterns hooded. Even breath seemed thinner. The cliff face ahead wore its old secrets well. There was a postern there, a goat track cut by masons who had been dust for centuries, a smear of stair under an overhang that looked like the lip of some enormous mouth. His scouts had found it 2 nights ago under a skein of gulls and a stink of cormorant. It led to a door that led to a winding that led to the belly of the dragon. The boats slid off their tackles with the patience of falling leaves. Iron men went down the nets and landed with the discipline of thieves who had lived this long by understanding the covenant of silence. Picked men, chosen by him from among the cruel and the clever. The silence's own, and reavers from Goodbrother and Harlaw, whose vows to their princes could be outweighed by promises of gold and a seat in the tale of the age. Euron's voice at last, low, amused, edged with a blade's caress. Do not rush. This place has 1,000 ways to kill you and 100,000 souls who would clap. Swords stayed sheathed. They carried short, single-edged knives and crossbows wound ahead of time. Grapnels with padded heads. A coil of chain so oiled it wept. A cask of pitch with a cork stopper thumbed by a man who knew how to keep it from squealing. Boots were wrapped in strips of sail to keep their nails from sparking on stone. Euron went last. He always did, and the men knew not to wonder at it because wondering they might find themselves thrown overboard. His hands found the ancient stone of the steps, rough, pitted, warmed by some depth heat that must have bled up from the mountain's sleeping fire. He paused and pressed his ear to the rock as if to a door in which he expected to hear music. The stone hummed, truly did. It hummed like a tooth at the edge of pain. He could almost see them. The kings who had never been kings, the Valyrian-blooded brooders in their dragon chairs, women with silver-gilt hair whose perfumes had been oils pressed from flowers that no longer grew anywhere in the world. The island still remembered their soft boots and their soft threats. It had soaked up their arrogance like salt and kept it. He liked that. He liked to think of arrogance as a spice to be pickled in stone. "Lord," murmured the man at his shoulder. "Pray to your salt god if you need him," Euron said and began to climb. The postern gate was wooden, banded with iron, old enough that the wood had become iron gray. 2 men kept watch. One was asleep. The other stared at nothing with the fixed, heroic vacancy of a man who has been staring at nothing for too many nights. They died the way good watchmen die, which is to say without noise. The key was on a ring, the ring on a hook, the hook on a nail. Nothing ever truly changes. Inside, the passage turned and turned, always upward, a corkscrew in a black throat. The air smelled of bat and old oil and that mineral tang he had learned to love in Cartha's black houses. When they paused to listen, the castle's breath muttered. The rasp of the sea at its root, the long intake of the wind across its crown. Far below, he imagined his ships holding their place by listening to, each or poised like a question. They reached a door with a hinge that would have screamed if the gods were still in the habit of screaming for men. It did not, for all things prefer to live. Beyond it was the sea dragon belly of a great hall with beams blackened by centuries of smoke and banners that had not been taken down because there had been no one to do the taking. The long table lay like a ship's keel thrown upside down. He put his hand on the wood, felt the familiarity of grain under his palm, the way a tree remembered wind. A boy tried to be a hero at the far end of the hall. There is always one. He had a billhook and the look of a Caro shoreman, too much crust in his hair to be a lord's son. The bolt took him through the lip, and he fell so gently Euron could almost believe the boy had chosen to lie down and listen to the stones hum. "Kitchen first," Euron said. "Men fill their bellies before they lift their swords." It was a piece of advice rather than an order, but the men took it as both. They moved through the underrooms like a taste of smoke. They found 4 men in the buttery and put them to sleep with hands they would not use again. In the kitchens, the scullions froze with ladles and knives, stupid with terror. Euron smiled at them as at children at a puppet show. "We come for your master's keys and your master's keys alone," he told them in a voice made mild by the sea. "Quiet now. You have all the same gods in the morning as you had last night." They knocked on the door of the castellan's chamber as if come to deliver bread. The man who opened it had washed his face too well for a night watch. His breath smelled of cherries and courage, which is to say wine. He was very brave and very killed. "Keys are easier to take this way." By the time dawn peeled the cloud back like old hide, the iron standard of the Kraken hung where the 3-headed dragon had flown, and the smoke streaming from the kitchens smelled of honest fat, pork, onion, barley. The harbor below was full of hulls. Pale surf walked in among the black teeth of the rocks, and jogs of foam caught on timbers like shreds of lace on a thorn hedge. Men were already at labor with cranes and capstans and a sort of joyous brutality, wrenching out rotten piles to make room for new, tearing at cleats that had rusted in place, swearing at pulleys that squealed like rats. The air was hung with the hammer's conversation with the anvil and the chesty sigh of bellows fed by men who had been promised gold and permitted to take glory. A dozen carcasses of scorpions crouched already on the ramparts like dour spiders. Qyburn's drawings had been precise, and his envoy a man who knew how to turn ink into wood and steel. Euron climbed the sea dragon tower and took his breakfast on the terrace that faced east. He ate as well as a lord should. Melara brought him a silver dish of eels and butter and a trench of black bread that had the near-sweet smell of barley. He sat alone. He always sat alone when he wanted the view to speak. The gullet lay ahead, a cleft in the sea between Dragonstone and the gentler green-patched island of Driftmark. Farther out, the narrow sea tightened its belt and vanished in haze. He could feel the currents pull even from up here, the stream that favored a ship going west if she slipped under the lee of the tail, the whirls where ships slowed as if reluctant to bring whatever they had seen in Essos into a bay that had so many graves. He could place in memory the beacons. This tower, the tip of the tail, sharp point on the cape, the small light on Claw Isle, the higher flame on Massey's Hook. A chain of answers to a knight's question. He thought of chains and smiled. He had seen Tyrion Lannister's trick in the Blackwater and admired it without envy. Such tricks were better done by braver men than lions. But he could manage something more patient. A boom across the main channel, chains on buoys of stripped and pitch-sealed logs, their anchor stones set by divers bribed with air by hose and promise. Towers with scorpions to make dragons reconsider and men rethink their oaths. Pickets of long, lean raiders at the stepstones to watch for a great fleet with a queen at its center and a eunuch whose voice had ruined many houses. He could feel it coming. Their belief in destiny would make them rash. He would do the less beautiful thing, the thing that smelled of tar and nail. "Your Grace." The voice was soft as a mouse. He turned only his head. Qyburn's envoy did not dress like a queen's hand. He wore a black robe with a collar of leather that could have been something picked up in a chapel, and smiled the way a man smiles when he suspects poison. "This seat belongs to my queen," the envoy said, eyes lowered in the proper way, which made it easier for Euron to dislike him. "Her Majesty sends her gratitude for your promptness." "Gratitude," Euron said, turning his spoon in the light. "It buys iron." "Does she send iron?" "She sends gold enough to purchase a city's worth of it, if a city could be smelted. More to the point, she sends casks." "Ah," Euron said, and let his smile show teeth now. "Not wildfire," the envoy said quickly, reading thought or posture. "For the secrets of that remain in King's Landing, and the Guild of Alchemists does not love the sea. But something nearly as instructive to men. Pitch refined in Qyburn's manner. Flame that clings like a bad marriage." Euron ate his eel. "You brought the drawings. Now bring me masons and men who can drive piles into bedrock without drowning. Bring me a scribe who writes fast. Bring me a whore with a sharp biting laugh. And bring me one of those little birds who listens without breathing." "Of course," the envoy said. He bowed almost to the floor. "And the horn." It had been wrapped in cloth and kept in the damp to keep its temper. The staggers of its ridges were like knuckles, and the glyphs on it were not letters so much as tiny coiled worms. When they had tried to sound it in the islands, men had died with steam at their lips and blistered tongues. Ships had trembled. Birds had fallen. The warlocks had told him what it might do if persuaded to remember. They had told him other things he did not believe because he had learned, traveling, that men in blue tongues and dark houses will promise you an empire when what they want is only enough coin for another mouthful of their favorite poison. Euron rested his hand on the horn now the way a father rests a hand on a sleeping child. "When the Queen's dragons come," he said, "we will play with their hearts. And if they do not come, we will make the world believe I could have done so. Belief is the softer metal, but it coins better." The envoy nodded. He was one of those men who believed that the safest place in a room was exactly 3 paces away from the most dangerous man in it. He had built a life on being 3 paces away. "Tell your mistress," Euron said, turning back to the gullet, "that her sea is shut like a hand." By noon that day, carpenters from the fleet, men who had built barns on Harlaw and storm sheds on Pike and had stronger wrists than most, were swinging mallets on the tail of Dragonstone, driving iron rings into stone faces that were too proud to scream. Divers went down in pairs, rope around their waists and the blessing of a mother who had made peace with grief. They set anchors like teeth in the channel floor, cursing the current like old friends mucking along a difficult road. A square-jawed boy from Old Wyke tied knots with a delicate speed and blushed when anyone praised him. A man from the Orkwood went blind for an hour after emerging and laughed at it and went down again. Beer was forbidden till dark. There were too many ways to drown sober. Drunk would be impious. On Driftmark, the fishmongers saw the kraken fly and sent a boy with bare feet to find the steward. The steward was an old Valerian bastard who had never been loved enough to be anything but dutiful. He stood on the palace steps and stared at the black standards and remembered when the dragon flew there and felt, in a shamefully sour place in his belly, that a black field with a gold beast suited these miserable times better than the red one ever had. He sent for his wife and told her to pack without folding. He sent for a boat and a pilot and a priest. He sent a raven to nowhere because there was nowhere that would answer honestly. He tasted the wind and knew hunger was coming like a winter with no manners. That night the first light beacon burned in the Sea Dragon Tower, a fat greenish flame in a brazen basket, and answers sprang up Sharp Point, Claw Isle, Massey's Hook. On the 3rd night the boom line floated, a procession of round logs tar-black and shining with oil, chained throat to throat like prisoners who had killed their jailers and were proud of it. On the 5th night, a ship out of Gulltown flew into the gullet like a hawk and found itself slowed by a net so patient it might have been woven by spiders who expected to live for 100 years. The captain screamed that he had papers from the Eyrie, and a man in a small boat asked what paper weighed against iron. Euron allowed that ship through, after her holds were lightened in his favor. Mercy is a story that travels faster than banners do and buys better. What news went westward over the water was not all he chose. Some newsmen make for themselves. An old pilot from the Hook had the bad luck to find his little hooker in the path of the silence at dawn. Euron had known him when he was 14 and called Rob of the Currents because he could stand on the bow and tell you what the tide was feeling. The man looked up with eyes that had learned not to be surprised. He saw the Kraken and was not surprised. He saw Euron and was not surprised. He saw the ropes hanging like invitations and was not surprised. He showed his empty hands. "You will not press me now, Crow's Eye," he said, in a voice like a stone inside a sack. "I press no man who has nothing worth pressing out," Euron said. "But I will press your boat into my service. I have need of light ships piloted by honest fear." "That fear costs," the pilot said. "All fear does. You will guide my pickets in the dark. You will teach my men which waters make liars of compasses. You will drink my beer and give me back my beer in skulls." The pilot loved the sea as men love clever children. He frowned, then nodded. Euron gave him a blue-striped shirt from Karth for his wife and told him to burn the shirt when she grew too fond of it. The pilot did not ask what that meant. News spreads in invisible ways too. In King's Landing, the small folk stopped saying that the Queen's enemies would come by ship and began to say that the Queen's sea had teeth now. In the Stormlands, men who called themselves Bar Emin and Buckler and Selmy drew maps in the dirt with sticks and saw that the dirt did not care. At Tarth, a girl in armor looked east across a gleaming slate and felt the weight of oaths that no longer fit a world whose edges had changed shape in the night. In a tangle of alleys behind the Red Keep, a rat-catcher died with a secret in his mouth because the boy with the knives in his sleeves had orders that went 2 lines deeper than he knew how to read. On the 8th day, the fleet from Essos was sighted. It came pale and shape-shifting out of haze, white sails like teeth on a comb, hulls from Tyrosh and Pentos and Myrine, hulls whose ribs had never been meant to taste this chill. The great flag of the 3-headed dragon led like a promise that had almost remembered its manners. Galleys beat for the wind as if they could charm it. The Queen's flagship had a ram with a head shaped like a dragon's, a dumb iron beast that would never breathe but had made 1,000 men believe. On the top of the foremast stood a very small man whose hair had grown salt at the temples, and he squinted as if reading letters written on the water. He knew this island. He had stood on it long before with a different master, and the rock had said different things to him then. Tyrion Lannister's hands gripped the rail the way a man holds the edge of an old painting he does not want to see again. The smell of kelp and tar rose like an accusation. His tongue ran over his teeth and found wine and too many words. He turned and saw the Queen beside him, standing with her arms folded, silver hair a quiet rope down her back. Daenerys Targaryen's eyes were on the windows that should have had her candles. He watched her not breathe for the space of 2 heartbeats. Missandei's voice, low, in Valyrian, so that only those who needed to hear would hear. "There are black flags there." Grey Worm's hands were quiet on the haft of his spear, but the spear's head had tipped just so, a movement that would only matter to men who counted such things. "Black," Daenerys said, word like ash. "A kraken," Tyrion said. "Euron. He boasts loudly enough for the wind to carry it. He has taken the island. He has made a harbor of the gullet." Her jaw moved once. He thought she was biting the inside of her mouth where no one could see the blood. Dragons do that. They learn where pain can be hidden and still be useful. "I will land," she said. "He expects you to," Tyrion said, gentle without softness. "He expects you to be what your enemies need you to be. He has planned for the you that you have been in their tales. And what tale would you tell of me if not that?" Her eyes had not left the towers. "The tale in which the wind can be asked to wait," Tyrion said. He pointed with 2 fingers that trembled less than they would have once. "Look," The line of bobbing, tar-black logs lay easy on the water at first glance. At second glance, they were a net with teeth that had been taught to swim. Behind them, nearer the island, squatted the Scorpion Towers, each with a crew like a squint-eyed centipede. Channels narrowed further by piles set cleverly in the shallows, so that a ship that thought herself safe would find her belly opened like a fish at the exact place where the Scorpions could bring their bolts home as a man speaks his own name. Above, men moved, and those men knew how to tell tide from current, luck from trick. "I will fly," she said then, the words almost the shape of breath. Tyrion had expected that too. He had counted the ways dragons could be lured. He had counted men like Qyburn who had made thinking a weapon in a city that did not like him for it. "He wants you to fly," Tyrion said. "He has horns in his pride. He has stories he tells himself about what a sound can do to a beast that remembers being a sound itself. He will make you test his tower there against your courage. He will pray that courage is not wisdom, because he has built for courage." She turned at last. The sea caught her hair and tasted it, and a gull made the sound of a hinge without oil. "I have not come this far to be turned by a raider," Daenerys said. "No," Tyrion said. "You have come to be more than what raiders turn. We can put into Dorne. We can find shelter in the Stormlands where old names still remember their honor. There are coves in Crackclaw with caves that swallow fleets if a man knows when to go in. Your dragons can eat without burning a tower to proof themselves. And the sea can be taught other lessons. Smugglers have written more scriptures about tides than priests have." Grey Worm looked at the line of black logs with the implacability of a man who had been trained not to read the sky unless ordered. "We break it." "Not here," Tyrion said. "Not with half the songs in the city waiting to hear what you are called when you fail." Behind them, a man with a cloak of blue so dark it drank light stepped up from the companionway. Varys's eyes were as patient as a trap. "We have made arrangements in Dorne. The Sands know how to keep a secret. The Queen of Thorns has sent us words too. She knows a thing or two about weeds that choke a garden." Daenerys's hands fell to her sides. She watched the tower again, but this time not as a thing to take but as a thing that made other things possible. Pleased Tyrion that he could see her think. It frightened him a little too, because he remembered men in that castle who had been made beautiful by their own planning and had burned the world to keep from seeing the uglier parts of themselves reflected back. "Signal the fleet," she said. "We turn for Sunspear. We will take Westeros by the roads not built to receive queens." Euron saw the flags change from the Sea Dragon Tower and laughed, a sound that made the gulls shy. The envoy from Qyburn stood beside him, hands tucked into his sleeves like a polite thief. "You will not chase her?" the envoy asked. "It would be dramatic." "I am not a minstrel," Euron said. "When the dog runs where the snare is not, you do not abandon the snare. You bait the other paths and let him find them. She will need grain. She will need iron for horseshoes and for the little nails that hold together the chairs where men sit to pretend to decide. She will need the river mouths. She will need to send messages that cannot be carried by dragons because dragons are seen by people who have eyes. We will take the mouths and we will take the little boats and we will make the coast a rumor that eats." He ordered out pickets to the stepstones, long, low ships rigged for taste rather than comfort, crews of men who could hold a course by the feel of the wind as it ran its nails along their jawbones. He loosed half a dozen fast galleys to nose along Massey's Hook and up to the Windwater, not to fight so much as to learn, whether the fishermen had changed their songs, whether the women at the wells had begun to draw in pairs, which tells a clever marauder more than a dozen scrolls. He sent gold to a man in Lannisport who had a cousin in Fair Isle, because gold, when thrown, tends to leave the hole you expected. He kept his best in the shadow of Dragonstone, polishing scorpions, making the horn comfortable in its damp. Night turned the gullet into a throat again, and the boom flexed like a snake shifting its spine. Torches smoked at intervals along the ramparts, smudges of orange on black. In the Sea Dragon Tower, Euron walked the long room where the dragon seat had been and where now there was only a hollowness shaped like glory. He put his hand on the stone where once a silver-haired boy had thrown a cup and had it come back to him like an answer. He did not believe in ghosts, but he believed that places learned how to be themselves the same way men did, by repetition, by habit, by the stories told within them. Below, in the kitchens, Melara wiped knives and asked the bones in her pocket to be reasonable. She was 40 and had a husband somewhere on a ship and a daughter in a house on the lee side of Driftmark where the roof leaked only when the wind came out of the east. She had lived under a dragon, a stag, a kraken now. She expected to live under stars again soon enough if she kept her head down. She liked the taste of eel and had never told anyone. On a bench by the harbor, a boy fell asleep on a coil of rope and dreamed he was deep. He woke with hemp marks on his face and a sense of having been spoken to. He looked at the black water and did not spit in it for luck the way his father had taught him, because suddenly that felt like shouting in church. In White Harbor, Davos Seaworth read the letter by candlelight twice, then blew the candle out and let the smell of tallow help him think. The Manderleys had given him a room above a salt store with a bed that rocked when men banged the barrels below. The words were not really a surprise. Of course the Ironborn had done a clever, rude thing. Of course they had chosen the place he had thought the girl would choose to come home to first. Men who took to the sea sometimes understood each other better than men who took to the game of chairs. He lit the candle again. He knew the gullet like a man knows an old scar. He could run a skiff under that boom on a tide that had been loosened by a west wind and a change in pressure you could feel in your knuckles. He could do it with one or shipped and the other held like a priest holds a sacrament. He could teach someone else to do it too, given time, and time was a thing that had begun to burn faster now that the dragon girl had turned to Dorne. He rubbed the stump of the finger he had once given to Justice and thought about the smell of pitch and the way a chain always spoke through the water if you listened with your hands. He went to find the young lord who had sent for him, a boy with a belly and a mind and a claim to things he could not yet lift. On the way he passed old men asleep in chairs with their hats on, as if the hat itself could keep their dreams from spilling out. He loved this town for its breadth and its greed and its ability to laugh with food in its mouth. He did not want to see it hungry. He had seen too many men find iron answers to hunger. When he reached the solar, Wyman Manderley's son rose half a finger's height and sat again because he had learned the limits of drama. Wendell was dead, and Wylis was the one who knew how to count, and the boy in front of Davos had learned that people without fathers who were alive had to make a habit of speaking softly. "Lord Davos," he said. "Ser Davos will do, Lord," Davos said. "I've been a lord a day and a night and slept through both." The boy smiled. "You know the gullet. Ido. Can it be broken?" "Everything can," Davos said. "The question is whether we can break it in the time we have with the knives we own while bleeding less than the other man. There are caves at Crackclaw a smuggler knows. There are nights when you can sail without being seen because no one believes a ship could love the dark that much. There are men who will carry letters in their own stomachs if you give them a reason to live long enough to shit them out." The boy blinked. Davos had forgotten he was talking to a child who had never been on the wrong side of a rope. He softened. "I can take a small boat through with the right tide," he said. "I can find a fisher from Massey's Hook who will take coin that smells of onions and forgive himself later. I can get to Dragonstone and see how tight the Kraken holds his ropes. With that, we can know where to cut without making him laugh. What will you need? A boat that is too tired to be proud. For men who do not panic. Oil for the oars. A woman who will cry at the right moment. And a pardon written with the right flourishes for when we are stopped by men who like the look of coin more than the look of a gallows." The boy stared at him, then nodded as if these were reasonable groceries. "And if you cannot get through? Then we know the size of our failure," Davos said. "That is a thing too." Back on Dragonstone, Euron walked along the boom with his boots leaving a slick print on the pitch, the way a man walks along a wall he has just built. Fully expecting it to hold and fully expecting to find in it that one stone that would betray him if he were not in the habit of coming at odd hours to check. He stopped where the chain met a great carved tooth of rock, where divers had set an anchor that would have done a castle proud. The chain there was as broad as his waist. He put his palm to it and felt it thrum faintly with the sea's constant hunger to unmake what men made. He liked that hum. It made him feel in conversation. He turned and looked inland. Dragonstone's courtyards were full of labor. A smith laughed, a deep, churchy sound. A boy ran with too many nails in his mouth. A woman stirred a vat of pitch, and her forearm was a black glove to the elbow. Two men dragged a spare scorpion arm from one yard to another and argued about balance. On the far wall, a man in a blue cloak watched everything as if he was counting breaths. Euron raised two fingers, and the man in blue lowered his head. Messages went out like the idea of rain. That night, he allowed himself a small pleasure. He had Melara bring him a wooden chair to the top of the Sea Dragon Tower, and he sat with his feet on the parapet and drank a wine the color of sunsets in places that did not have the decency to be cold. He thought of his brothers. Balon had been a rope that had frayed. Aaron had been a prayer with teeth. Victarion would be where he always was, wrapped in the certainty that having a task made a man complete. Euron did not believe in completion. He believed in the art of the next thing. The horn lay in his lap, wrapped. He did not sound it. The world was not yet tuned to that key. He stroked the cloth, and in doing something so small managed not to think about the boy he had been once, waiting for a father's hand to fall and learning from that how to stand very still. The pickets brought news. A galley with golden prows nosing along the shore near Blackwater Bay like a gossip. Fires on the beach below Sharp Point that came and went as if men could not decide if warming fingers was worth the risk of making a tale for another man. Fishermen had changed their songs. In taverns in Duskendale, they had begun to sing a thing that had a chorus in it like a knife's flash. The Queen's Sea has teeth. Euron bought that song as if it were a horse, and men took his money and did not feel the burden of it because nothing costs more than a chorus that has lodged. In Sunspear's shadowed palace, Olenna Tyrell took a letter and put it down and took a sip of lemon water and did not even make the face she usually made afterward. "So the brute has strapped a gate across a throat," she said. "Men do like to think of the world in terms of things they can clamp." Daenerys sat and listened to a woman whose flowers had turned to razors. "We can march," the queen said, a new word in her mouth. "We can move north along the Prince's Pass. We can come into the Stormlands where men once would have cheered my father's name. We can make friends of them or make an example of the first man who will not. And while we march, we can send a skein of small boats up the fingers of those coasts till the Kraken is plucking at 100 lines at once. A beast tires. You will need a little man for that," Olenna said, and tilted her head toward Tyrion as if indicating a cat who had once taken cream and now took more complicated things. "Their sort are good at skeins." Tyrion looked at the map and saw tittlelines in the ink where a clumsy hand had licked the brush. "We will need Davos Seaworth too," he said. "He knows how to lie to water without making it hate him. And I will learn the smell of that man's chain," Daenerys said, eyes far east. "I will know its iron. I will know which bolt had been hammered by which hand. I will make a litany of it." At night, in a tent that smelled of oranges and lamplight, she dreamed of a black gate across a dark river and of a voice speaking from behind it in a language she had almost learned as a very small girl. In the dream, she did not burn the gate. She learned the name of each bar and called them by those names until the gate grew embarrassed and came apart. On Driftmark, the old Valerian bastard steward opened his shutters at dawn and watched a little boat run the boom. It did it with insolence and grace. Nose up, one or stuttering, the other making a long, low arc like a man riding on water. He did not cheer because he was not a hero. He noted which buoy the boat had touched first. He told no one but his wife. Later, when the Iron Men came to ask if he had seen anything, he told them a story about a seal that he had been told as a boy. He filled the empty parts of the story with details about the seal's whiskers because men who lie without small truths always look like fish on a board. Davos's boat hid inside a cave that the sea had eaten with patience. He sent his men to sleep with their tunics open because something about sleeping with your belly bare makes you wake as if the world still wants you. He sat at the mouth of the cave and listened to the boom weeping against its iron. He could time a heartbeat by it now. He could smell the pitch. He could taste where the men who had worked it had kept their wine because men always spill a little when they are happiest. He whispered to the water and felt foolish and loved. He made his run 3 nights later when the wind did a small, courteous thing it only did on nights when the moon scar was the right shape. They loaded nothing that could clink. The woman who would cry did not have to be told when. Davos reached out and held the chain with both hands as they eased beneath it, and his hands said to the chain, "It will only be for a moment." He could name each iron link by temperature alone once they were under. He thought he might well live to hold his granddaughter and tell her this was the closest he had ever come to prayer. They came up under Dragonstone's lee, so close to the stone that the rocks scraped the boat's paint. He tasted dust that had not been breathed in a century. He smelt the breath of a volcano that had fallen asleep at table with its face on its arm. He touched the postern with the back of his hand and felt, of all ridiculous things, welcome. He had come here once with a man who had never been warm enough, and the stones remembered. Inside, the castle sounded like work. Davos felt that in his ribs. He knew the rhythm of men who had come to stay. He moved through rooms where he had once stood and did not see the ghost of himself because he did not have time for that. He placed 3 messages where only men who cleaned good corners would find them and 2 where only men who lazed would. He made a note in his head about the scorpions, how the bolts were stacked, whether the ropes were fresh, whether the crews wore their sleeves rolled or not. He did not touch the horn. You do not touch a thing like that if you were born in Flea Bottom and learned anything worth keeping. On his way out, he saw a woman he recognized without knowing her name, her arms black to the elbow with pitch. She looked up at him, and he put a finger to his lips, and she nodded as if he had told her exactly what to do with a pig on a hot day. He left by the same cave when the water's conversation returned to the part of the tale he preferred. Euron slept for a hand of hours in the middle of a day because sometimes the best way to catch a man is to be awake at a time he thinks no one is. He woke to the sound of ropes singing in a particular way, a chord that meant, "Something small has made a cunning choice." He smiled, did not rise, lay very still and fell asleep again. When he woke, he ordered oil shaken in the right places and bolts counted out loud. He never told anyone why. Men would only make ceremonies out of it. A week later, a ship from Gulltown tried the boom again with letters tied to an anchor line and a priest at the bow singing a song about privilege. The priest died of an early, accidental flight. The letters were read and appreciated, and some were even delivered. Mercy is a kind of arithmetic. Then the first real bite came, not at the boom but at the soft place the boom created further up the coast. 2 small coves in the hook that the Iron Men had not troubled because their bottoms were stone and their winds contrary. Fires sprang up there in the same hour in 2 places, a signal that was not meant for Euron but for men who thought like cats. One of his pickets took a man who would not stop smiling and carried him to Dragonstone in the bottom of a boat with his hands and feet both bound not for necessity but as an apology for how easy he had made himself to catch. The man's ears were pierced so that the lobes almost hung like petals. He smelled of cloves and a fish market. Euron had him brought into the Sea Dragon Tower and seated in a chair that had once had dragons carved along the arms and now only had the memory of the knife's work. "You smile too much for a man who has lost his breath," Euron said. "I have not lost it yet," the man said, showing teeth with a gold cap shaped like a seed. "I have misplaced it temporarily. You are too pretty for a fisherman." "I am too pretty for most things," the man said. "I am here to tell you that the Queen is already north of you and south of you and west of you. You have made a strong door. You have forgotten to look at the walls." "Have I?" Euron asked, amused. "Tell me where to look." "In White Harbor," the man said. "In Fairmarket. In Duskendale behind the tavern where the floor slants and men think they are drunker than they are. In Sisterton where the women laugh at men who call themselves pirates because they have never met women. In the mouths of rivers where men count fish and dreams with the same skeptical grammar. You have blocked a narrow sea. She will use the lands wide." He shrugged, the least elegant thing he had done. "And why would you tell me this?" Euron asked. "Because I carry 3 other messages in my gut," the man said. "And one of them is for you. I would prefer not to break it open prematurely."
Euron Loghead.
He liked men who kept their bargains with their own bodies. He had the man fed a stew with too much barley in it and wine that had been warmed so it would go down quick. He kept him in a room whose window could see the boom. He sent him out the next day with a letter of passage that would keep him from being stabbed by men who could not read, which covered most of the men who would stab him. "Give my regards to your mistress," Euron said at the quay. "Tell her I like what she is trying and that I have made something beautiful of wood. Tell her beauty is not only fire." The man bowed as if at a dance and left with a boatman who used his oars as if they were part of a conversation. He did not want to be overheard. The sea grew busier in ways that did not threaten the boom. Little boats like beetles, the sort that carry letters and are never caught unless someone with a finger missing asks for them by name. Euron let most of them through. He took a few and changed their letters and a few. Days later, a troop of men-at-arms rode to a village that no longer existed because he had hired fishermen to show the men where a village might exist if someone were to look for it. He did not bother to be pleased. It was only work. Fire broke out one night in a store of pitch near the water. It should have taken the whole quay. It did not, because the woman with the black arms had learned, years ago, on a boat with a bad captain, to throw wet wool at such fires before they remembered to climb. She did, and the flame went from greenish to sullen and then to something like shame. The men called her witch and did not mean insult by it. Euron heard and smiled. The boom creaked. The sea breathed. The scorpions sat and learned patience in the hands of men who still preferred axes. The horn slept. And far inland, in the riverlands where the light comes diluted by leaves, a woman who had once been queen of spiky gardens lay on a couch and told a young queen a story about men who had thought that gates meant kingship. And the young queen listened with her fingers on the table like a pianist who had not yet had a lesson but knew already how music must feel. She imagined the boom's links falling off one by one because each had a name she had learned too carefully. She imagined riding past Dragonstone without looking at it because there are some enemies you honor by refusing to make them the measure by which you decide your day. The tide made appointments the way only tides can, and kept them. The wind fell out of the east and then came up, sly, from the south. A gull stole a fish from another gull and acted as if generosity were a quality that could be forced. In the cave under Crackclaw, Davos counted his men with a touch on the ankle because names carried further, and one of them was missing and then not missing because he had been pissing in a place that turned out to have a better echo than the rest. On Dragonstone, Euron lay awake and watched the shadow of a vein make squares of darkness move across the opposite wall, and he liked that more than he had liked most women. At sea, Daenerys dreamed of a river whose banks were made of ash, and woke angry and calm at once. Tyrion drew little pictures of chains on a scrap of parchment and then rolled the parchment up and fed it to a lamp because he believed in the luck that comes from letting fire eat your worst ideas. On the 15th day after the Kraken's flag had learned to enjoy the wind above Dragonstone, the first of the deep ships from Pentos, pretending to be a timber runner bound for Blackwater, put her nose experimentally toward the boom. Men at the Scorpion squinted. A pilot from the Hook licked a finger and held it up and felt the wind speak some small, coarse joke to it. From the deck of the Silence, Euron watched with the patience of a man who had taught himself to take delight from delay. He held the horn in his lap. His thumb traced the shape of one of the glyphs. He did not know if it meant anything. He understood that not knowing was a part of what he liked. Men around him were too sure of their gods. He preferred his mysteries slightly unaligned. The Pentoshi ship slowed just enough to look thoughtful. Then, with a judicious flex of oars, she kissed the boom in a place that had been meant to be kissed so that the iron would accept the compliment without deciding to respond. Euron nodded, almost respectfully, and let her come in. He imagined the look on the captain's face when he found his hold a little lighter going out. He pictured how the man would reconcile that with whatever vow he had made in the temple to some god with a kind face and an expensive taste in fruit. You could control a sea by chains, yes. You could also control it with stories. Euron laid the horn down and rose. He did not have to fight a battle yet. He had made one. He would walk along it again at dusk, a father along the beds of sleeping children who had not yet learned that sleep is the most dangerous choice a heart makes. On the far shore of the narrow sea, in a place where men brew beer that tastes like bread, a woman with hair the color of iron watched a caravan load sacks of grain and think about which road had the fewest men with bad patience. She did not know a kraken flew above a black castle. She only knew that the world had shifted. In King's Landing, Cersei watched the smoke from the alchemist's guildhouse curl and imagined it writhed because the fire had learned to tell stories about her. She liked the shape of the word blockade. It sounded like a man pressing the flat of his hand on a table to silence servants. And beneath Dragonstone, in the hot tunnels where the mountain slept with one eye open, a fissure ran along a line that had been waiting for a century, the way a seam waits in a garment, and a stone fell very small into a pool that hissed. No one heard it. These are the sorts of beginnings that do not believe in trumpets. When midnight made the world thin, Davos dipped his oars and went again, this time with a scrap of parchment that had more hunger than ink in it. The chain touched his shoulder like a blessing that wanted to keep a promise. He passed beneath with a courage he did not name and turned his head to mark the way the buoys moved against the stars. He would remember that dance for as long as he had a head to keep memories in. He thought of a boy on Dragonstone who had been given a statue of an onion and had not thrown it away because pride, once tasted, is bitter to purge. He did not see the man on the parapet watching without moving because the man did not want to be seen. The man watching thought of a different boy, one with a blue cloak and a smile that was almost awkward, and decided with a slow carefulness that some knots could be untied slower than others and still be undone. He folded his hands into his sleeves and let the wind do that small, courteous thing again. At dawn, the boom glistened, the chain sang, the sea's heart kept time against a black island's ribs. Euron Greyjoy stood where he had stood before and watched for a moment any man could have believed was simply a moment. He thought then of horns in houses with no windows. He thought of queens who had learned to make oaths out of breathing. He thought of men like Davos who loved a small boat more than a kingdom and of how such love could wreck your plans if you did not make room for it. He smiled because he had made room. Not enough, never enough, but enough for today, which was a kind of victory that men too grand usually forgot to count. In the palace in Dorne, Daenerys Targaryen came to a balcony with a view of a courtyard where orange trees had outlived 3 princes. She stood there with her hands looking like they could hold a world without crushing it. She turned her face east and named her enemies in order of usefulness. She promised to learn the names of gates and of doors and of the men who made them and undid them. When she went inside, she did not look back. The sun climbed and found a way through leaves to a table where a map waited. The light made the rivers bright as if they were already moving according to her will. The narrow sea was not closed, not truly. Seas do not close. Men try to make them behave. For now, at Dragonstone, a gate was set across a throat and a hand held it steady, and elsewhere, other hands began to gather on the walls. The day did not know which story to believe yet. Could be taught. It would take time. There are wars that begin with thunder. Some begin with the weight of pitch on a woman's arm, and a smuggler's breath held beneath a chain, and a raider who can sit perfectly still in the hour when many men get up because they think dawn is an argument they can win. It rained in threads at dawn, not enough to make a man go in, just enough to make every surface a whisper. The boom wore the rain like beads. It rang in the chain and made each link say its name more clearly, a recital with iron vowels. From the top of the Sea Dragon Tower, Euron watched the narrow fall and thought of a boy in the Isles hanging from a cliff by his fingertips and laughing because if you laugh you cannot hear your own breath ask rude questions. The rain made the scorpions look patient. It made the men look honest. He liked mornings that taught humility. "Your Grace," said Melara, because she had been told to bring him the stew with barley early when the weather had that smell in it. She had tied rags above her elbows because pitch lingered in the bend of the arm elsewise and made eating like a negotiation with a dull god. "You saved my quay," Euron said, not turning. "You threw sheep at a sea fire like a priest throws sense at grief." "Wool, not sheep," she said, unafraid to correct him as if he were a man like other men. "And wet, else it only prays to join the blaze." He turned then and looked at her face without reading it. He was good at that, at letting a face be a face until it needed to be a target. She had the kind of mouth that people trust to tell them if a plum is ripe. Her eyes had learned how to look at more than one thing at once and not let either notice. "What would you do if a dragon came?" he asked. "Keep my head down," she said. I have not done anything a dragon would remember. Everything that breathes has done something a dragon would remember, Euron said. Their memory is made of air. Does your husband love you? She put the trencher down on the parapet. Sometimes. It is enough. He smiled. I have noticed that sometimes is a measure men use when they are afraid to count. Ask him if he wants a berth near where the sea is honest. I have a longship that needs a man who sits quiet when the wind changes. If he says no, do not tell me. I dislike men who say no for reasons I cannot admire. He fishes, she said. So you told me, Euron said, and returned to the view. A fisherman is only a patient thief. Tell him his net can be a rope if he lets it. He ate 2 spoons of stew and left the rest for a gull bold enough to believe in rank. He did not thank her. She did not expect it. There were economies on islands that had never been written down, and on the days that men remembered them, the world went more cleverly. Below, the morning swelled into a day that wanted to be about repairs. Men hauled cussed. Bolts were hefted one by one from the racks to the scorpions and back again in the manner armies practice the thing they will do in a storm when the world will pay for their clumsiness. The black logs of the boom nodded, as if agreeing with a story they had been told so often they knew it better than the man telling it. Divers took wine in their food because a little wine underwater makes a man believe he is clever enough to hold his breath longer without dying for it. A slender boy wrote numbers on a slate with chalk and then wiped them away with a piece of dry bread and ate the bread because the salt had made it taste as if it had earned its keep. The envoy from Qyburn stood in his dark robe in a place where the wind could not find him and counted quietly in a language that was not spoken to children. On Driftmark, the old bastard steward met a woman by the drying yard where strips of cod hung like coarse flags, and he told her, "There will be need of a girl who can go to market in Duskendale and buy onions without anyone knowing whose purse paid for them." She told him, "My niece has that face that drops out of a crowd like a pebble out of a hand." He said, "Tell her to bring back a story with the onions, about which men are singing and whether their songs are about the sea having teeth or the teeth having a sea." She said, "And if she does not come back?" He said, "Then she will have learned a lesson no ant should have to set." When Davos came in across the flats under Crackclaw, the boat made a sound like a man clearing his throat politely. They had put rags around the tholes and oars to keep the kiss from squealing. He made the men step ashore into mud rather than let the keel say something to the pebbles that would carry. He would rather clean boots than bury them, which is a philosophy that has saved as many lives as swords. He left the boat in a place where the tide would reach to its thighs and stop out of a shy respect for an old log. There are places water will not go because they remind it of old humiliations. They moved inland through scrub and birch, the light gone thin by leaves. A girl with a hare lip sold them milk that tasted of patience. An old man with a nose a hawk might admire gave Davos a glance that measured guilt and let him go on because guilty men spend better than those who believe their coin pure. At a blackthorn hedge, a boy had built a ladder out of twined boughs without being asked and sat astride it with the dignity of a king of very small things. Davos gave him a copper and told him to buy a knife too long for a boy. He did not know why he said that. Sometimes the mouth is quicker than the mind, and sometimes that is a blessing disguised as stupidity. In Sunspear, the air sat like a cat and thought about moving. In the garden with the orange trees, Daenerys walked with Missandei and said few words because you must not talk too much in a garden or the place will choose to be about your noise. The leaves gave off their clean, sweet sting when brushed. Somewhere, water slid from bowl to bowl, an argument being resolved with courtesy by men who had designed it centuries ago and were now dust in chests that smelled of sweet resin. "I could have flown," Daenerys said at last. "You could have," Missandei said. "I would have been who they expect me to be if I had," Daenerys said. "The fire that comes when insulted. The hand that knocks because it cannot wait to see if the door will open for a voice." Missandei said nothing. She had learned that she did not need to furnish her queen's thoughts with furniture. Her presence was a kind of grammar the world used to make sense of Daenerys' sentences. "I do not want to be the story men write to afterward tidy their fear," Daenerys said. "I want to be the weather and the road. I want to be the reason a harvest is counted full and no one agrees on why. but a gate in the sea offends. It says, "We have measured you." "Then unmeasure them," Missandei said gently. "Teach them to count again." Grey Worm stood at a distance where he could be reached with a glance. He watched the walls. He watched the way the light came through the carved screens and made sword shapes on the floor that no hand held. He watched the servants because men who carry plates learn things that war forgets. Tyrion waited in a room that smelled of old spice and new ink. He had a map rolled out under a bronze weight shaped like a lizard. He held a cup he did not drink and a thought he did not want to use. When Daenerys entered, he pointed not at the map but at the cup. "You have one for every room," she said, and his mouth did that amused thing that almost took its own advice about not making easy faces. "It is a habit from a life in which wine made men tolerable," he said. "We have intelligence." "Davos," she said, not a question. "He went through," Tyrion said. "He has counted bolts, he has smelled their pitch, he has learned the names men use when they think no one is listening. He says there is a place where the chain is made arrogant by the rock that holds it. There is a weakness that will become weaker when the sea pretends to be kind for an hour. And can we get men there with knives?" "Knives will do something," Tyrion said. "Better. Rope, wedges, oil, wet wool. I have spoken to fishermen from Massey's Hook. I have spoken to a bastard from Driftmark who knows which side of a lantern to shade. I have spoken to a crabber from Claw Isle who says Lord Celtigar is a weather vane with no wind left to turn him." He tapped the map. "Here. A night when the tide runs slow west and the wind forgets itself for a bell or two. We can unmake a length of chain if the men at the Scorpions blink at the same time." "Men like Grey Worm do not blink when told not to," she said. "That is why we must not tell him to be a scorpion," Tyrion said. "We will send men who have learned how to stand still while stealing. We will ask Grey Worm to be where a spear must suddenly be. We will use both kinds of courage and hope Euron prefers to hold a single measure in his head." She looked not at the map then, but at his hands. They trembled a little, and she did not pretend not to see it. "Do you fear him?" she asked. "Only as much as is polite," Tyrion said. "He is a man who has made friends with emptiness and learned how to decorate it handsomely. If he were only cruel, I should not fear him. But he enjoys patience, and such men make me careful." "Careful is not slow," she said, a rebuke to the world more than him. "No," he said, and now drank. "Careful is the speed a city learns in a famine. We must not feed it to ourselves as if it were a stew." Cersei Lannister sat by a window of dull light and watched men drill with crossbows as if the shape of watching could change them. Qyburn stood behind her, hands in his sleeves. His hair was the color of candle smoke left on a ceiling after a winter too long. "They look like men," she said. "I asked for machines. I have made the machines they can be," Qyburn said, "and taught the machines how to forgive their users. The Scorpions are mounted where your visitors will be reminded of them at the last. The bolts are tipped to catch and carry fire that does not argue when asked to cling. And a long chain for the river can be reforged if you wish, though the city does not enjoy memories of that." "Let them learn to," Cersei said. "I will feed them better memories later. What of the Iron Bank?" "They like gates," Qyburn said. "Gates make men pay. They will send a man who smiles as if he had invented iron. When he comes, we will show him rows of men with scorpions and ask him whether he prefers to be repaid in gold or in story." Cersei smiled in a way that gave nothing to anyone. "He will choose story and pretend it is gold. Send to Dragonstone. Tell Euron I will have more pitch and I will have the city talk about his gate as if it were a new god. Men will bow to it and swear by it when they stub their toes. And tell him—" She paused, tasting the pleasure of the next words like a sweet she would make last. "Tell him that when the dragon comes, he may use his toy if he believes in it. I prefer to watch belief do the killing, if it will. Instruments are more obedient than belief," Qyburn said mildly. "Not always," Cersei said, "but the moments when belief does what I want are worth the years of training iron to behave." In a tavern in Duskendale where the floor slanted enough to make a man excuse himself before his cup, A woman with a hare lip sold onions to a soldier who practiced looking generous. She watched which way he held his head when he laughed and filed that away because men's necks tell you more than their mouths. She listened to a song that used to be about a girl with a ribbon and now was about a sea with teeth and amended the verses in her head where they lied about tides. She left with coins hidden in her hair in a way that would make it too expensive to cut. When she came to the gate, the guard looked at her mouth and then at his own hunger in a way that was not kind. She put a hand on her belly and looked at him with the face of a woman who knows precisely which room a midwife can be found in at any hour. He waved her through because some hungers are cowards. The pickets at Massey's Hook saw fires at two coves again in the same hour, and the pilots told them it meant some. One thinks we are men who like to hear the same joke twice. They went to one cove and left a man at the other who had learned to sleep with one eye open before he had hair to be proud of. He had a horn that made a thin, angry sound and a knife he had never named because naming a knife is a kind of bad luck in a place where you must draw it without letting the sea see you do it. When he saw the small boats slip in under belly-black clouds, he did not blow the horn because he liked his own breath. He lifted a lantern twice inside his cloak and put it down where no one would imagine light could have gone. Two other lanterns answered far off, careful as conspirators. Varys met a Celtigar in a room with a crab carved into the mantel big as a wheel. The Lord's hair was the red of climate rather than wine. His hands had never learned the pen's callous because men had written for him. He had a voice accustomed to rehearsed contempt and a heart with rot in its pride, which is a condition that must be cultivated over centuries of men believing they are clever for the same reasons their grandfathers were. "You are late," Lord Celtigar said. "I am on time enough for what I am," Varys said. "There are stairs cut into a rock south of your island. Your grandfather's men used them when the dragon did not want to see you go. Have you patched them?" The Lord opened his mouth to lie and then closed it because lying to this man felt like urinating in a temple. "They are not as they were," he said finally. "The sea teaches stairs humility. That is their better quality," Varys said. "Do you have men who can be trusted to forget what they saw after they have been paid?" Celtigar smiled with teeth that wanted to be yellow but had been scoured too often by a cautious wife. "For the right coin, my men will forget they were born." "Do not ask them that," Varys said. "We want them to remember how to go home." Davos came down to the cave again with oil under his nails and numbers crowding his head. He gave a torn scrap of parchment to a boy who would run it through the hook to a woman who would knot it into her hair and turn that hair into a story in a town where stories made coin breed. He showed Grey Worm a knot he had learned in a part of the world where men tie a boat to a tree and the tree later tells the boat a secret. Grey Worm took it into his hands and learned it without looking as if he were taking it in at all. "You will need to move like water that does not intend to get anyone wet," Davos said. Grey Worm nodded once. "We will be water. You will need to leave men behind," Davos added, and the air in the cave changed shape as if what he had said had done something to the barometric pressure. "It is a narrow place. If the alarm cries at the wrong time, the tide will become a wall that cannot be argued with. Choose the men who can die without having to break anything inside themselves first." Grey Worm looked at the men he had chosen already, and a muscle he did not know he had made a small, private motion near his throat. "I will choose." When the night came that had been waited for, it came with a small perfidy in it. The wind turned when it had promised to stay. Men had to alter what they had taught their hands by a fraction, and that is where the world takes its toll if you let it. The first rope went over the seaward side of a lower platform where a scorpion crouched. The man on duty had found religion in a small brown bottle and so snored piously. The rope made no noise because rope is a gentleman when asked. Grey Worm's palms burned with the good hurt of useful friction. He went over the parapet with a grace that did not ask for praise. 3 behind him, a Dornishman kissed his finger for a lover in a town too far away, and then stopped because the lip salt was wrong to bring to that kiss. They crossed the stone like memories, present enough to alter the room, subtle enough to leave it unchanged to any man who had not loved it. Grey Worm put his hand to the first wedge holding the chain to the iron ring. He felt where the blacksmith had doubted himself and hit again, harder, and left a bruise of metal that meant, "Pry here." He slid the wedge and the chain side, a sound like a man relieved at last of a pride that had given him backache. Another man oiled the pin of the great shackle until the oil itself smelled embarrassed to be asked to change sides. A third wrapped wet wool just a little where a spark might pretend to be more than it was. A gull screamed in its sleep. That happens. Gulls dream too. A guard opened one eye and convinced himself he had opened both, which saved a life for half a minute. Grey Worm lifted his hand, froze the men like deer, felt the winds like change shape again, moved. The second wedge, the second sigh. They were a bell's width from loosening one side of the chain when the foolish part of the night noticed it was being used. A bolt loosed from the neighboring tower by hands that had not yet met daylight that day and so were too eager. It skipped along the parapet like a flat stone kissed by a strong arm and took the Dornishman who had kissed his finger earlier along the neck in a slice that did not so much cut as unfasten him. He put his hand to it and gave a little surprised sound, like a child seeing the sea's edge for the first time. He sat down as if told to. Grey Worm moved before the sound of the bolt hitting stone finished its work on the air. He dropped and became shadow, dragged the body where it would not tell the story it found itself tempted to tell. The cry went up then, as cries will. The men finished the second shackle pin with a cruelty they had the decency to dislike later. They went over, down, into water that clutched and did not forgive. Scorpions woke. They turned slowly. Crews swear. Ropes tangle in their own cleverness. A man with oil on his arms loses the bottle and tries to pretend he meant to. Grey Worm lost one more man to the sea when a rope went slack at the wrong moment and the tide had nothing but contempt available. He reached the boat with lungs that felt like pounded fish. Davos hauled him in by the scruff of the neck as if he were a cat. And Grey Worm endured the indignity because breathing is a set of manners you relearn when necessary. They pushed out, hugging the base of the wall where the scorpions could only point like men swearing they would fight tomorrow if only they had eaten better today. Two bolts hissed over the water and said nothing that mattered. One slammed into the stone and sang, briefly, a note that made a boy in the boat make the sign he had been taught against a different god entirely. On the parapet, Euron stood with bare head and the horn under his arm, and listened to the ripped piece of song the knight was trying to sing. He did not shout. He did not ask for blood the way lesser captains do when they feel their men need to see them wanting it. He let the crews work. He let the lieutenants who had talked about readiness dry-mouthed discover which parts of readiness had been about their mouths and which had been about their hands. He looked at the chain in the wet light and saw the small new ease at a place that had been tight before. It pleased him the way a scar on a rival's face pleases a man. It means the rival lived and can be made to live again for more beautiful hurts. "Fetch the horn," he said to no one because it was already there. "Your Grace," said the envoy, "the Queen has asked you to use your instrument when you believe in it." "I do not believe in anything," Euron said cheerfully, "but I believe in the noise a thing makes when men expect it to be silent." He did not put the horn to his lips. He handed it to a man whose horoscope had been unlucky since birth. Too strong for cleverness, too loyal for longevity. The man took it with the face of a hound given an order to fetch a burning brand. He braced his feet, put the rim to his mouth and blew. Sound does not always travel. Sometimes it lifts the place it is born in and sets it down slightly to the left. The horn spoke a note like metal learning thirst. It was not loud in the way thunder is loud. It was loud in the way a thought, once thought, cannot be untaught. Men dropped what they were holding not to cover their ears, but because their hands suddenly remembered a loss. The boom shivered. Birds in the cliff went quiet not out of fear but out of etiquette, because everything that had once believed itself a dragon stopped in the same instant to see whether the world was admitting a mistake. Far to the south, where dunes bend like old men, Drogon lifted his head off the sand. His sleep had been the sleep of a predator. Eyes hooded rather than shut, breathing arranged to seem like death to things that wanted to test their luck. His tongue touched air with interest. The other two raised their heads as if summoned by a memory rather than a call. Muscles shivered along their flanks with that tapping tremor horses have when flies are too clever. They looked at the Queen because even the fiercest animals prefer to be told their names by a familiar voice when the world asks them a question. She stood and came close and put her hand on Drogon's side and felt the ripple there, a low tide running under skin. "Easy," she said. That word had done work for her before. It did a little now. Drogon's heart steadied the way a drum steadies when a drummer who has been away returns and fits his hands to leather. The sound faded, not in the air, which had never truly held it, but in the bone, where it is worst. The blower of the horn fell where he stood, knees first, as if asking the floor to intercede with someone. Then the rest. His mouth steamed in a cold that was not outside him. He joined a class of men whose service is measured by a single useful death. "Again?" the envoy asked, thrilled and hateful. "No," Euron said, smiling as if to a child with a dangerous toy. "A man who understands music knows when to stop playing so the next note will be asked for rather than endured." He looked toward the south where he could not see dragons and felt the aftertaste of the note in his own chest. He had not believed in the horn. He did not believe in it now, but he felt the way belief in it altered other men. That would do. The next day, the boom held with a new lean at one place and a careful arrogance at another. Men talked about the note more than the night's fight. Rumor insisted a dragon had fallen out of the sky and sunk with the chain wrapped around its belly, which is the sort of story men tell because they prefer a carcass to a calculation. Euron let that lie travel without putting shoes on it. It walked well enough barefoot. Davos wrote on a board with charcoal and then wiped it with spit and wrote again. He drew the chain and marked the shackle they had loosened and then drew the wind he wanted to have on a night he could not promise. He told Tyrion, "We can open a finger's width. We cannot yet force a hand through." He said, "The horn is not a horn in the old sense. It is a knife for the inside of a man's skull." He said, "If she flies, she must fly with wax in her ears, like the tale sailors tell to scare boys, only this time it is a brave thing to do instead of a vain one." Tyrion said, "I will buy wax in every market between here and Storm's End." Davos said, "Do not buy it in a block. Buy it thin as if for a woman who makes candles and reaches hands small enough into narrow molds." Tyrion smiled and wrote that down because he liked the shape of a mind that always thought of hands when discussing the world. Grey Worm sat with his men and said the names of the two who did not return without looking down. He did not say the word sacrifice because he disliked words that tried to make trade sound like prayer. He said, "If we go again, we do with 2 more ropes and 1 less knife. We do with a piece of wood the size of a man's hand in each belt to slide under chain when it wants to crush. We do with oil on the inner elbow, not on the palm, because the palm lies when it is tired." His men listened. They had been raised on a curriculum of pain but had added to it in the city the habit of improvement, which is a luxury armies seldom afford. The envoy sent to Cersei wrote in a trim hand that the horn had sounded and the heavens had blinked. Cersei read and laughed and said to no one, "I will crown him with rope when I am done." Qyburn asked her if he might have the corpse of the blower, and she said, "Take it and make some use of it. At least its mouth is quiet now." He wanted the lungs, for he had a thought about resonance that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with how air is taught to behave in a cavity. Cersei did not care. The city tasted of soot and lemon and iron, a combination she found tonic. Men in Duskendale made little horns from the ends of conches and blew them into the faces of their children to make them squeal in that way children squeal when their fear is a game and leaves no bruise. In White Harbor, Wylus Manderly read a letter and put his head in his hands and laughed until he wept, which alarmed his servants, because laughter is less expected from a lord behind a closed door than weeping. He sent to Davos a soup of onions so thick it could forgive any sin and a ring that would pay the bearer's way through any of his lesser gates, which is more useful than 10 prayers. On Dragonstone, Melara went home to her husband at a lodging under a roof that leaked on the nights when the wind could not be trusted to remember its side of the bargain. He sat at their table with his hands around a mug as if trying to keep it warm with remorse. He said, "There was a man who spoke to me today and offered me a berth and a chance to die far from you in a manner that could be called glory if one were inclined to charity." She said, "Was his eye blue?" He said, "Like the air before lightning." She said, "Do not go." He said, "If I do not, You will bury me here because men who do not go drown in their own houses when the sea comes politely through the door one day and asks if anyone remembers a debt. She put her hand on his cheek and said, "Bring me stories if you must go. Bring me stories that make me miss you less before they make me miss you more." He said, "I will bring you a rope from a chain with a stain where a king once touched it." She said, "Do not bring me parts of other men's pride. Bring me something that can be used to hang fish." He joined a picket. He learned a lane of black water that behaved like a cheap friend. He sang with men who had salt between their teeth that looked like diamonds to those who did not know the taste. He came home 3 times. The 4th time, he stayed a week. The 5th, he did not come at all for a month. And when he returned, he had a cut on his forearm in the shape of a map of an island she had never visited. She put her mouth to it and learned the taste of places she would not see. Tyrion wrote to a man in Gulltown called Mori of the Ropes, who had taught a generation of boys how to keep their hands busy when their fathers were at sea. He asked him to send 6 dozen little boats with broad bottoms that could ride over trouble rather than through it, and to send them creaking, and to paint them as if no one who painted them had been praised for care. He asked him to put into the hands of those boys 3 things. 1. A canvas funnel the size of a man's chest. 2. A sack of burnt sand. 3. A lie about where they were going their mothers would believe. He paid in a foreign coin whose silver made men talk. He asked Olenna to write a note to a woman who owned 3 kills near Rosby. He asked Varys to ask the wind to be tired at an appointed hour, which Varys said he would do, and then laughed at himself softly, remembering the days when he had once believed in omens and then had learned to make them. The plan was this, if plan is not too proud a word for a pile of hopes dressed in rope. Boats to the boom with funnels to feed wet sand and ashes into the links, choking the oil and making grit a 3rd partner in a marriage that had only meant for 2. Wedges under the loosened shackle, a heavy tide that had been promised by a moon that had not yet broken, a promise Davos could remember. Men on the towers looking the wrong way for the length of a short song. It was not a plan that would be sung about later because songs like Clean Edges and Named Heroes. It was the sort of plan cities owe to men who have learned their streets by foot. It was the sort of plan that, if it worked, would be called obvious by the sort of men who wake late and always believe breakfast had been waiting for them. Euron received 3 pieces of news that afternoon. A gull with a broken foot had taken to landing exactly on the horn's cloth like a priest who knows where the altar is softest. A diver had found a weak spot in the southern anchor stone that would need a new tooth. And a child had been born on the quay, and his mother had given him a name that meant chain, in a dialect of a village that no longer existed. He took all 3 as applause. He sent to the southern anchor and told the men to work without beer, which made them love him only slightly less than when he let them drink. He told the man who kept the horn to move it. He sent the child's mother a handful of small coins that had been in his mouth for an hour so they tasted like iron and invitation. He did not know why he did that last. He did not need to know. Night again. A milky thinness to the sky. A sound in the water like men murmuring in another room. Boats went out from places where they had learned to leave without being noticed. They carried funnel and ash and men whose hearts had learned how to be still in crowded rooms. The boom nodded at them as if recognizing kin. On the parapets, men made themselves comfortable the way men in faithless places do. Knife at hand, blanket ready, 1 boot unlaced for quickness, and a memory to hold in the mouth in case there was time to regret. Davos's hands were black up to the wrist with soot that would not wash off easily. He liked that. He liked to wear a plan, to have its dirt on him. He did not believe in cleanliness as a moral quality when work needed doing. He put his boat into the seam he had taught it to love. He felt the tide under him as one feels a horse being kind to a rider who once fell and has mounted again. He put the funnel into the mouth of a link that had been asking to cough all day and fed it the sand as if feeding a sick child medicine you pretend is sweet. The chain took it in, choked, learned a new music. A boy beside him grinned without meaning to, teeth very white in that darkness, and then remembered where he was and made his face serious in a hurry. Grey Worm held the rope on the tower with his thigh and his palm and watched for the small motion a man makes when a lie he was told finally wears out. He saw it in the way the Scorpion crewman set his foot just a little too close to the pivot, a small miracle of incompetence, and he tugged. A man below moved, wedged. Another pushed with the outer edge of a shoulder, silent. The pin sighed again. The chain took in water and did not enjoy it as much as it had been taught to. At the southern anchor, Euron stood because he had learned to be where pride would put its knife if it were him. He had a man with a hammer who could strike in a way that made two metals make peace. He had another with a lamp shaded so beautifully it threw a whisper of light that had no sharp edges. He could feel the chain enjoying a hurt and tell himself he was pleased by the honesty of it. He could smell grit where grit should not be. He lifted a hand and the hammer paused without having been told to. "Here," he said, "pal. Am against iron. Here, where the men who came in the night insisted on the wrong kind of silence." He smiled because if you cannot smile when a rival remembers your face well enough to mark your pride, you do not belong at sea. The chain took the tide's hand. The tide pulled like a wrestler patient enough to wait for a breath. The link that had been loved with sand, loved too much, shifted. The wedge slid. The pin turned like a stubborn thought seeing another angle. The whole delicate ruin of men's certainty moved a thumb's width. Boats in the dark went light underfoot with the joy of leverage. Ropes sang that hard, quiet song that men who sleep in houses never learn. Davos felt the water under him say, "Go." Then, he went, then. The chain dipped with a heavy reluctance that had been asked very politely by men who knew how to ask. For a heartbeat or two or three arranged side by side like stones in a dry wall, there was a gap you could aim a promise through. A long sloop from Gulltown that had been circling like a gull that refuses the bait came in and slid through as if greased with a story. In its belly were letters that would make men ride in places they had not planned and sacks of coin that would be spent on lies and good bread and a new pair of boots for a boy who would never take them off in the house. Two other boats came after because men like to imitate the most recent courage. The third snagged on something in the water that had been a log and had been taught to be a soldier. It scraped with a noise that made a scorpion on the parapet think of finally acquitting itself. A bolt flew, missed, hissed into water, and went to the bottom clumsy and embarrassed and angry. The chain rose back, not to where it had been, never again to where it had been, but to a dignity that would serve until the next tide taught new manners. Euron laughed, not loudly, and patted the chain as you pat a horse made anxious by thunder. He tied a rope around the pin himself, feeling with his hands where another man's intent had passed like heat. He put his head down as if listening at a door, and the chain, proud as it was, told him a little. He said to the men, "We will sleep in our boots tonight and keep our mouths closed else sand thinks it is welcome." He said to the horn, "Not yet, you have had your song, the next is for the city." He said to the envoy, "Write to your mistress and tell her I have discovered belief can be trained." Tyrion sat with the map and put 3 pebbles along a line and a seed where the chain had let the boat through and then swept his hand and did not pretend to be a god or a child. "A beginning," he said to no one. Then to Daenerys when she came, "A beginning that will be called inevitable later by men with ink who were asleep tonight. I will not burn him for this," she said. "I will burn him for something else. I will write down the reasons in order," Tyrion said. "It comforts me to number. 1. He believes in very little and so prides himself on teaching others to. 2. He has learned to admire the patient kind of mischief. 3. He has made of Dragonstone a song men would rather sing than go hungry. 4. He has put his hand to iron, and iron remembers him." He looked up. 5. We do not need to imagine him. We can unmake him with work and weather. She touched the map as if the rivers there were warm. "And if I flew with wax, you would be making a story for men who will wish later to pretend you were only fire," he said. "You are more used to your cause when you are not simple to praise." She turned and went to the balcony and watched the sky as if it had written her a letter. In the courtyard below, the orange trees held small green fruit that would later be bitter and then sweet if anyone had the patience. She could be patient. It had not been that way once. It would be now. She put a hand on the stone balustrade and felt the warmth it had gathered for her from the day and took it like a gift from a creature that could not help being generous. In the lower yard of Dragonstone, Melara sat with her back to a wall and her hands in a bucket that stung because someone had lied and put lemon in it. She scrubbed pitch out of the new seam in her arm hair and thought about ropes as if they were recipes. She had learned the names of the links in the section they had loosened with a tenderness that embarrassed her. She had never loved a man like that. Perhaps she had loved her daughter like that once when the girl was very small and sleeping and could be picked up with wrists and ankles together as if the whole body were a soft bundle. She dried her hands and went to find her husband to ask him about the way the tide had moved at the southern anchor, because she had not been there with her eyes, and she trusted his better when they spoke about water. The envoy wrote a neat letter and sealed it with wax that smelled of smoke. He described the horn's effect without adjectives. He described the chain's wound without metaphor. He described Euron's smile with a word that could be read either as admiration or alarm depending on which language you used to translate it. He liked to write like that. It made him feel he had given everyone what they deserved. Cersei read and thought, "The world is composed of men who believe in instruments and men who believe in the theater of using them." She believed in both. She sent for a dress with a collar that made her neck look like an answer. She sent for the septa who had once made her walk and asked her to carry a message to a charity. She dismissed her without listening to the answer because she had already written that part of the story in her head. She went to the window and saw the river and the people on it small as lice and thought, "A chain here, a chain there. Gates and gates. The city will be taught to call it safety." She smiled and did not look at the dull place the sunlight made on the floor, because it reminded her of shade you could not put back once it was moved. In the Crackclaw Cave, Davos slept without the dignity of a lord and with the honesty of a man who had used everything in him but not squandered it. In his dream, he was under the chain again, and it was a woman's arm across his chest, heavy and warm, and he had to lift it carefully to get up and piss without waking her, and he woke laughing at himself and then, unexpectedly, not laughing because the old feeling of a wife in a bed is a kind of chain men wear gladly and lose too often by accident. The sea kept on with its work. It is very patient. Men do their work too. It is less patient but sometimes more cunning. The boom creaked. The tide lay down where it had stood yesterday a little differently. The scorpions were oiled and cursed and threaded. A man wrote a song about the gap and ruined it with too much chorus. Another wrote a poem about the horn and omitted the bit where men died. Boats came, boats went. People were born. Vows were made in rooms where the walls had opinions. A storm lifted its head on the far edge of the horizon and told itself a story about how it would be welcomed at Dragonstone. The mountain under the castle turned on its other side and muttered again, and a fissure widened a hair, and a drop of water fell on a ledge and waited for company. Euron walked the parapet at noon, and the shadow of the sea dragon tower made a clock of things. He touched the stones and the iron and the wet wood with a practice that was not quite affection. He thought of Daenerys Targaryen walking in a garden built by men who slept with perfume on their wrists. He thought of a little man drinking carefully and adding up debts most people pretend do not exist because they are paid in commodities like breath and patience. He thought of a smuggler who knows his own height by the marks left on him by places he had squeezed under. He thought of a woman with pitch up to her elbows throwing wet wool on a fire that would have loved to become a public spectacle. He thought of his own brothers and did not let it make him sentimental. He adjusted a wedge with his hand. He held his breath for the pleasure of feeling the chain hum through his palm. He smiled, not at anyone, but at the way the day fit like a good glove. When the storm came, it would test all of it. The horn would speak or be silent. The chain would be stubborn or regrettable. The men in their towers would be too brave or not enough. The boats would seize this inch or offer their bellies to the next. For now, the sea glittered where it forgave, and the narrow sea was what men said it was, which is always the most dangerous hour in any tale, when the naming seems sufficient. The world breathed, and the gate across the throat breathed with it, and both were waiting to see which would tire of the other's patience first.